To start with my sigh, it has been quite a day. But I felt it would be nice to come on and just record something, just document something about the day, because it was so strange. I had an accident today. It was quite alarming. I'll probably talk about it once I have some more people watching. But yeah, that was difficult. That was a very difficult thing to go through. And I'm still kind of in shock about it. I'm not seriously hurt from what I can see, but the stress of it, the adrenaline of it was like more than my little body can handle, I think. I mean, obviously I'm handling it, but ugh. And it's MLK Jr. Day, and I work on that day. It's so interesting because we get all the like DEI stuff, but I didn't notice any acknowledgement of this particular holiday, and I wonder if it's becoming less important in people's minds. I don't know. They made a big deal out of it when I was younger, and I feel like still, I mean, the government employees seem to celebrate it, but doesn't seem to be really even acknowledged much as a holiday. And I feel it should be because, in the middle of January, I need a day off. That's just, apart from anything else, apart from the legacy of this man in this country, I also need that. And I thought I might try to read something from this book, but as I'm looking through it, is it showing up? I did not even realize that I had not fixed my camera settings here to not do that. Okay. Wow. I thought they were. I thought I had it on a mirrored setting. How strange. Maybe it's not supposed to be mirrored. It's supposed to be like that. Oh, that looks strange to me. But I guess it's supposed to be like this. Wow. All right, so let's try that again. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community by Martin Luther King Jr. But yeah, I'm looking through it and I don't feel inspired to read anything. How funny. How funny. So I don't know if we'll be really doing anything to celebrate this holiday. The language in this, a lot of it, it's not language that people use too much. I don't know. This is interesting. He's kind of talking about his experiences organizing and kind of the conflicts he had with other organizers in the second chapter. Might read this. Sounds like interesting history. James Meredith has been shot. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Monday in June 1966, and I was presiding over the regular staff meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in our Atlanta headquarters. When we heard that Meredith had been shot in the back only a day after he had begun his freedom march through Mississippi, there was a momentary hush of anger and dismay throughout the room. Our horror was compounded by the fact that the early reports announced that Meredith was dead. Soon the silence was broken, and from every corner of the room came expressions of outrage. The business of the meeting was forgotten in the shock of this latest evidence that a Negro's life is still worthless in many parts of his own country. When order was finally restored, our executive staff immediately agreed that the march must continue. After all, we reasoned, Meredith had begun his lonely journey as a pilgrimage against fear. Wouldn't failure to continue only intensify the fears of the oppressed and deprived Negroes of Mississippi? That word is I've heard like white people use it referencing these kind of materials, and it's one of those words that is just not common language anymore, and I don't know why it fell out of favor, but sometimes I feel uncomfortable like even reading it. So I'm just reading it because that's what's written, and I believe that's important to do. Would this not be a setback for the whole civil rights movement and a blow to nonviolent discipline? After several calls between Atlanta and Memphis, we learned that the earlier reports of Meredith's death were false and that he would recover. This news brought relief, but it did not alter our feeling that the civil rights movement had a moral obligation to continue along the path that Meredith had begun. The next morning, I was off to Memphis along with several members of my staff. Floyd McKissick, National Director of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, flew in from New York and joined us on the flight from Atlanta to Memphis. After landing, we went directly to the municipal hospital to visit Meredith. We were happy to find him resting well. After expressing our sympathy and gratitude for his courageous witness, Floyd and I shared our conviction with him that the march should continue in order to demonstrate to the nation and the world that Negroes would never again be intimidated by the terror of extremist white violence. Realizing that Meredith was often a loner and that he probably wanted to continue the march without a large group, we felt that it would take a great deal of persuasion to convince him that the issue involved the whole civil rights movement. Fortunately, he soon saw this and agreed that we should continue without him. We spent some time discussing the character and logistics of the march and agreed that we would consult with him daily on every decision. As we prepared to leave, the nurse came to the door and said, "Mr. Meredith, there is a Mr. Carmichael in the lobby who would like to see you. And Dr. King. Should I give him permission to come in?" Meredith consented. Stokely Carmichael entered with his associate, Cleveland Sellers, and immediately reached out for Meredith's hand. He expressed his concern and admiration and brought messages of sympathy from his colleagues in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. After a brief conversation, we all agreed that James should get some rest and that we should not burden him with any additional talk. We left the room assuring him that we would conduct the march in his spirit and would seek as ever before to expose the ugly racism that pervaded Mississippi and to arouse a new sense of dignity and manhood in every Negro who inhabited that bastion of man's inhumanity to man. In a brief conference, Floyd, Stokely, and I agreed that the march would be jointly sponsored by CORE, SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, with the understanding that all other civil rights organizations would be invited to join. It was also agreed that we would issue a national call for support and participation. 1 hour later, after making staff assignments and setting up headquarters in the Reverend James Lawson's church in Memphis, a group of us packed into 4 automobiles and made our way to that desolate spot on Highway 51 where James Meredith had been shot the day before. So began the second stage of the Meredith, Mississippi Freedom March. As we walked down the meandering highway in the sweltering heat, there was much talk and many questions were raised. "I'm not for that nonviolence stuff anymore," shouted one of the younger activists. "If one of these damn white Mississippi crackers touches me, I'm gonna knock the hell out of him," shouted another. Later on, a discussion of the composition of the march came up. "This should be an all-black march," said one marcher. "We don't need any more white phonies and liberals invading our movement. This is our march." Once during the afternoon, we stopped to sing "We Shall Overcome." The voices rang out with all the traditional fervor, the glad thunder and gentle strength that had always characterized the singing of this noble song. But when we came to the stanza, which speaks of black and white together, the voices of a few of the marchers were muted. I asked them later why they refused to sing that verse. The retort was, "This is a new day. We don't sing those words anymore. In fact, the whole song should be discarded. Not 'we shall overcome,' but 'we shall overrun.'" As I listened to these comments, the words fell on my ears like strange music from a foreign land. My hearing was not attuned to the sound of such bitterness. I guess I should not have been surprised. I should have known that in an atmosphere where false promises are daily realities, where deferred dreams are nightly facts, where acts of unpunished violence towards Negroes are a way of life, nonviolence would eventually be seriously questioned. I should have been reminded that disappointment produces despair, and despair produces bitterness, and that the one thing certain about bitterness is its blindness. Bitterness has not the capacity to make the distinction between some and all. That's an interesting statement. Let's read that again. Bitterness has not the capacity to make the distinction between some and all. Yeah, that's very true. When some members of the dominant group, particularly those in power, are racist in attitude and practice, bitterness accuses the whole group. At the end of the march that first day, we all went back to Memphis and spent the night in a Negro motel. It's so interesting, like, reading this, because, I mean, segregation was a way of life. The fact that they stayed in a motel and that it would even be noted to be specifically run by and for Black people. I mean, it's hard to envision sometimes when I think about it, like, that people were that separated. I mean, what was that like? That must have been a whole different world. I mean, it was, and it wasn't. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, I stopped there. Since we had not yet secured the tents that would serve as shelter each of the following nights on our journey. They were camping in tents. Interesting. The discussion continued at the motel. I decided that I would plead patiently with my brothers to remain true to the time-honored principles of our movement. I began with a plea for nonviolence. This immediately aroused some of our friends from the Deacons for Defense, who contended that self-defense was essential and that therefore nonviolence should not be a prerequisite for participation in the march. They were joined in this view by some of the activists from CORE and SNCC. I tried to make it clear that besides opposing violence on principle, I could imagine nothing more impractical and disastrous than for any of us, through misguided judgment, to precipitate a violent confrontation in Mississippi. We had neither the resources nor the techniques to win. Well, that's sensible, isn't it? Furthermore, I asserted, many Mississippi whites, from the government on down, would enjoy nothing more than for us to turn to violence in order to use this as an excuse to wipe out scores of Negroes in and out of the march. Finally, I contended that the debate over the question of self-defense was unnecessary, since few people suggested that Negroes should not defend themselves as individuals when attacked. Right. The question was not whether one should use his gun when his home was attacked, but whether it was tactically wise to use a gun while participating in an organized demonstration. If they lowered the banner of nonviolence, I said, Mississippi injustice would not be exposed and the moral issues would be obscured. Next, the question of the participation of whites was raised. Stokely Carmichael contended that the inclusion of whites in the march should be de-emphasized and that the dominant appeal should be made for Black participation. Others in the room agreed. As I listened to Stokely, I thought about the years that we had worked together in communities all across the South, and how joyously we had then welcomed and accepted our white allies in the movement. What accounted for this reversal in Stokely's philosophy? I surmised that much of the change had its psychological roots in the experience of SNCC in Mississippi during the summer of 1964, when a large number of Northern white students had come down to help in that racially torn state. I've actually met some freedom riders, like white kids from the North who went south to help with the SNCC campaign, and it's just remarkable. It was such a, I mean, they really, I don't know, a lot of them just have the most interesting stories about like why they chose to do it, how they did it, their experiences they had, and what their parents thought. I'm reading from Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community by Martin Luther King Jr. Since it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I thought we'd be festive and read a little bit of his work, because this is the thing. Before I get back into it, just read the people. Don't talk about historical figures, what they thought, what their beliefs were, if you don't read their actual words. I think MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. is somebody important to be familiar with the work of and the philosophy of, just historically in the U.S. So yeah, I thought we'd do a little reading. I wasn't sure what to read, but this sounded like an interesting piece of history to share. So yeah. I know. And I was remarking on this too. Like, it's not what it used to be. People are not as into it as they were, which is so interesting because, like, with the amount of virtue signaling like going on in the world, you would think that they'd be all over this day, you know? But not really. And I don't know why. But anyway, let's return. Okay, so we're talking about his understanding. Okay. What the SNCC workers saw was the most articulate, powerful, and self-assured young white people coming to work with the poorest of the Negro people and simply overwhelming them. I can imagine so, yeah. That summer, Stokely and others in SNCC had probably unconsciously concluded that this was no good for Negroes, for it simply increased their sense of their own inadequacies. Of course, the answer to this dilemma was not to give up, not to conclude that blacks must work with blacks in order for Negroes to gain a sense of their own meaning. And the answer was only to be found in persistent trying, perpetual experimentation, persevering togetherness. Like life, racial understanding is not something that we find, but something that we must create. What we find when we enter these mortal planes is existence, but existence is the raw material out of which all life must be created. A productive and happy life is not something that you find, it is something that you make. And so the ability of Negroes and whites to work together to understand each other will not be found ready-made. It must be created by the fact of contact. Along these lines, I implored everyone in the room to see the morality of making the march completely interracial. Consciences must be enlisted at our movement, I said, not merely racial groups. I reminded them of the dedicated whites who had suffered, bled, and died in the cause of racial justice, and suggested that to reject white participation now would be a shameful repudiation of all for which they had sacrificed. Finally, I said that the formidable foe we now faced demanded more unity than ever before, and that I would stretch every point to maintain this unity, but that I could not in good conscience agree to continue my personal involvement and that of SCLC in the march if it were not publicly affirmed that it was based on nonviolence and the participation of both black and white. After a few more minutes of discussion, Floyd and Stokely agreed that we could unite around these principles as far as the march was concerned. The next morning, we had a joint press conference affirming that the march was nonviolent and that whites were welcomed. As the days progressed, debates and discussions continued, but they were usually pushed to the background by the onrush of enthusiasm engendered by the large crowds that turned out to greet us in every town. We had been marching for about 10 days when we passed through Grenada on the way to Greenwood. I mean, okay, this march, 10 days, and they were camping and then getting up and marching some more. I mean, woof. Wow. When you think about it now, like, I just don't see people take actions like this now. You know, they don't organize. Like, I haven't seen any organization like this in my lifetime. I mean, can you imagine marching through city to city? Just, I mean, the effect it must have had on them, you know? Okay, Stokely did not conceal his growing eagerness to reach Greenwood. This was SNCC territory, in the sense that the organization had worked courageously there during the turbulent summer of 1964. As we approached the city, large crowds of old friends and new turned out to welcome us. At a huge mass meeting that night, which was held in a city park, Stokely mounted the platform, and after arousing the audience with a powerful attack on Mississippi justice, he proclaimed, "What we need is Black power." Willie Ricks, the fiery orator of SNCC, leaped to the platform and shouted, "What do you want?" The crowd roared, "Black power!" Again and again, Ricks cried, "What do you want?" And the response, "Black power," grew louder and louder until it reached fever pitch. So Greenwood turned out to be the arena for the birth of the Black Power slogan in the civil rights movement. The phrase had been used long before by Richard Wright and others, but never until that night had it been used as a slogan in the civil rights movement. For people who had been crushed so long by white power and who had been taught that Black was degrading, it had a ready appeal. Immediately, however, I had reservations about its use. I had the deep feeling that it was an unfortunate choice of words for a slogan. Moreover, I saw it bringing about division within the ranks of the marchers. For a day or two, there was fierce competition between those who were wedded to the Black Power slogan and those wedded to freedom now. Speakers on each side sought desperately to get crowds to chant their slogan in the loudest. Sensing this widening split in our ranks, I asked Stokely and Floyd to join me in a frank discussion of the problem. We met the next morning along with members of each of our staffs in a small Catholic parish house in Yazoo City for 5 long hours. Oh, Lord. 5 hours? And they've been marching and having rallies. God, oh, how exhausting. For 5 long hours, I pleaded with the group to abandon the Black Power slogan. It was my contention that a leader has to be concerned about the problem of semantics. Each word, I said, has a denotative meaning, its explicit and recognized sense, and a connotative meaning. A denotative meaning and a connotative meaning. Its suggestive sense. While the concept of legitimate Black power might be denotatively sound, the slogan Black Power carried the wrong connotations. I mentioned the implications of violence that the press had already attached to the phrase, and I went on to say that some of the rash statements on the part of a few marchers only reinforced this impression. Stokely replied by saying that the question of violence versus nonviolence was irrelevant. The real question was the need for Black people to consolidate their political and economic resources to achieve power. Power, he said, is the only thing respected in this world, and we must get it at any cost. Then he looked me squarely in the eye and said, "Martin, you know as well as I do that practically every other ethnic group in America has done this. The Jews, the Irish, and the Italians did it. Why can't we?" "That is just the point," I answered. "No one has ever heard the Jews publicly chant a slogan of Jewish power, but they have power. Through group unity, determination, and creative endeavor, they have gained it. The same thing is true of the Irish and Italians. Neither group has used a slogan of Irish or Italian power, but they have worked hard to achieve it. This is exactly what we must do," I said. "We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power. This is the kind of legitimate power we need. We must work to build racial pride and refute the notion that Black is evil and ugly. But this must come through program, not merely through a slogan. Stokely and Floyd insisted that the slogan itself was important. How can you arouse people to unite around a program without a slogan as a rallying cry? Didn't the labor movement have slogans? Haven't we had slogans all along in the freedom movement? What we need is a new slogan with Black in it. I conceded the fact that we must have slogans, but why have one that would confuse our allies, isolate the Negro community, and give many prejudiced whites who might otherwise be ashamed of their own anti-Negro feeling a ready excuse for self-justification? Why not use the slogan Black consciousness or Black equality, I suggested. These phrases would be less vulnerable and would more accurately describe what we are about. The words Black and power together give the impression that we are talking about Black domination rather than Black equality. Stokely responded that neither would have the ready appeal and persuasive force of Black power. Throughout the lengthy discussion, Stokely and Floyd remained adamant, and Stokely concluded by saying with candor, "Martin, I deliberately decided to raise this issue on the march in order to give it a national forum and force you to take a stand for Black power." Who the hell does Stokely Carmichael think he is to force Martin Luther King to take a stand for anything? Like, I don't know, everything I've ever read about him and everything I've ever seen about him, he's just such an arrogant prick. Like, no offense, no offense. No offense, but like, just everything I read about him, he's like, so like, who the heck are you, buddy? Like, to talk to anyone the way you do. Like, he just, like, so many people I've read, like so many of his peers read, just describe him being this like very macho, like, pig. I don't know, like, what you're gonna talk to, also, like, you're gonna talk to a reverend that way? Like, really? Like, where is his respect? I want to force you to take a stand for Black power. Like, you're really gonna talk to a reverend that way? Okay, dude. I laughed. I have been used before, I said to Stokely. One more time won't hurt. The meeting ended with the SCLC staff members still agreeing with me that the slogan was unfortunate and would only divert attention from the evils of Mississippi, while most CORE and SNCC staff members joined Stokely and Floyd in insisting that it should be projected nationally. In a final attempt to maintain unity, I suggested that we compromise by not chanting either Black Power or Freedom Now for the rest of the march. In this way, neither the people nor the press would be confused by the apparent conflict, and staff members would not appear to be at loggerheads. They all agreed with this compromise. But while the chant died out, the press kept the debate going. News stories now centered not on the injustices of Mississippi, but on the apparent ideological division in the civil rights movement. Every revolutionary movement has its peaks of united activity and its valleys of debate and internal confusion. This debate might well have been little more than a healthy internal difference of opinion, but the press loves the sensational, and it cannot allow the issue to remain within the private domain of the movement. In every drama, there has to be an antagonist and a protagonist, and if the antagonist is not there, the press will find and build one. All right, so let's see, part 2. I feel like I can get through. Oh, there's part 3. Would you all like me to continue? I don't know if I'll get through the whole chapter because it's that much. Oh my. But I feel like continuing. I'll continue for now. So Black power is not part of the nomenclature of the national community. To some it is abhorrent, to others dynamic. To some it is repugnant, to others exhilarating. To some it is destructive, to others it is useful. Since Black power means different things to different people, and indeed being essentially an emotional concept, it can mean different things to the same person on differing occasions. It is impossible to attribute its ultimate meaning to any single individual or organization. One must look beyond personal styles, verbal flourishes, and the hysteria of the mass media to assess its values, its assets, and liabilities honestly. First, it is necessary to understand that Black power is a cry of disappointment. Interesting. The Black Power slogan did not spring full grown from the head of some philosophical Zeus. It was born from the wounds of despair and disappointment. It is a cry of daily hurt and persistent pain. For centuries, the Negro has been caught in the tentacles of white power. Many Negroes have given up faith in the white majority because white power with total control has left them empty-handed. So in reality, the call for Black power is a reaction to the failure of white power. It is no accident that the birth of this slogan in the civil rights movement took place in Mississippi, the state symbolizing the most blatant abuse of white power. In Mississippi, the murder of civil rights workers is still a popular pastime. In that state, more than 40 Negroes and whites have either been lynched or murdered over the last 3 years. Yeah, I mean, just that history there of the Mississippi. And not a single man has been punished for these crimes. More than 50 Negro churches have been burned or bombed in Mississippi in the last 2 years. Yet the bombers still walk in streets surrounded by the halo of adoration. This is white power in its most brutal, cold-blooded, and vicious form. Just because they wanted to register people to vote, just because they wanted to give American citizens the right to vote, I mean, you really think about it, like all of that organizing. People talk there, and of course, there's a lot to criticize in the civil rights movement. Obviously, people talk a lot of junk about it, but like, really, and there were many places that were just appalling. What was going on was appalling and so unjust, and Black people in many places were like, I don't know, like almost they were a different caste. It was very, very, I don't even know how to describe, how horrible the conditions were, and how they had no real say in like the government or anything, even though they were the majority of the population in many areas. Like, that is that just? No, it isn't, is it? But anyway. Anyway, let's keep going. Many of the young people proclaiming Black power today were, but yesterday, the devotees of I don't like the way I read that. the devotees of black-white cooperation and nonviolent direct action. With great sacrifice and dedication and a radiant faith in the future, they labored courageously in the rural areas of the South. With idealism, they accepted blows without retaliating. With dignity, they allowed themselves to be plunged into filthy, stinking jail cells with a majestic scorn for risk and danger. They nonviolently confronted the Jim Clarks and the Bull Connors of the South and exposed the disease of racism in the body politic. If they are America's angry children today, this anger is not congenital. It is a response to the feeling that a real solution is hopelessly distant because of the inconsistencies, resistance, and faint-heartedness of those in power. If Stokely Carmichael now says that nonviolence is irrelevant, it is because he, as a dedicated veteran of many battles, has seen with his own eyes the most brutal white violence against Negroes and white civil rights workers, and he has seen it go unpunished. Their frustration is further fed by the fact that even when blacks and whites die together in the cause of justice, the death of the white person gets more attention and concern than the death of the black person. Stokely and his colleagues from SNCC were with us in Alabama when Jimmy Lee Jackson, a brave young Negro man, was killed, and when James Reeb, a committed Unitarian white minister, was fatally clubbed to the ground. They remember how President Johnson sent flowers to the gallant Mrs. Reeb, and in his eloquent "We Shall Overcome" speech, paused to mention that one person, James Reeb, who had already died in the struggle. Somehow the president forgot to mention Jimmy, who died first. The parents and sister of Jimmy received no flowers from the president. The students felt this keenly, not that they felt that the death of James Reeb was less than tragic, but because they felt that the failure to mention Jimmy Jackson only reinforced the impression that to white America, the life of a Negro is insignificant and meaningless. There is also a great disappointment with the federal government and its timidity in implementing the civil rights laws on its statute books. The gap between promise and fulfillment is distressingly wide. Millions of Negroes are frustrated and angered because extravagant promises made little more than a year ago are a mockery today. When the 1965 voting rights law was signed, it was proclaimed as the dawn of freedom and the open door to opportunity. What was minimally required under the law was the appointment of hundreds of registrars and thousands of federal marshals to inhibit Southern terror. Instead, fewer than 60 registrars were appointed, and not a single federal law officer capable of making arrests was sent into the South. As a consequence, the old way of life, economic coercion, terrorism, murder, and inhuman contempt has continued unabated. This gulf between the laws and their enforcement is one of the basic reasons why Black Power advocates express contempt for the legislative process. The disappointment mounts as they turn their eyes to the north. In the northern ghettos, unemployment, housing discrimination, and slum schools mock the Negro who tries to hope. There have been accomplishments and some material gain, but these beginnings have revealed how far we have yet to go. The economic plight of the masses of Negroes has worsened. The gap between the wages of the Negro worker and those of the white worker has widened. Slums are worse, and Negroes attend more thoroughly segregated schools today than in 1954. How interesting. When was this published? (1968). Okay. 1968, we're reading from. The Black Power advocates are disenchanted with the inconsistencies and the militaristic posture of our government. Over the last decade, they have seen America applauding nonviolence whenever the Negroes have practiced it. They have watched it being praised in the sit-in movements of 1960, in the Freedom Rides of 1961, in the Albany movement of 1962, in the Birmingham movement of 1963, and in the Selma movement of 1965. But then these same Black young men and women have watched as America sends Black young men to burn Vietnamese with napalm, to slaughter men, women, and children, and they wonder what kind of nation it is that applauds nonviolence whenever Negroes face white people in the streets of the United States, but then applauds violence and burning and death when these same Negroes are sent to the fields of Vietnam. All of this represents disappointment lifted to astronomical proportions. It is disappointment with timid white moderates who feel that they can set the timetable for the Negro's freedom. It is disappointment with federal administration that seems to be more concerned about winning an ill-considered war in Vietnam than about winning the war against poverty here at home. It is disappointment with white legislators who pass laws on behalf of Negro rights that they never intended to implement. It is disappointment with the Christian church that appears to be more white than Christian, and with many white clergymen who prefer to remain silent behind the security of stained glass windows. It is disappointment with some Negro clergymen who are more concerned about the size of the wheelbase on their automobiles than about the quality of their service to the Negro community. It is disappointment with the Negro middle class that has sailed or struggled out of the muddy ponds into the relatively fresh-flowing waters of the mainstream, and in the process has forgotten the stench of the backwaters where their brothers are still drowning. Second, Black power in its broad and positive meaning is a call to Black people to amass the political and economic strength to achieve their legitimate goals. No one can deny that the Negro is in dire need of this kind of legitimate power. Indeed, one of the great problems that the Negro confronts is his lack of power. From the old plantations of the South to the newer ghettos of the North, the Negro has been confined to a life of voicelessness and powerlessness. Stripped of the right to make decisions concerning his life and destiny, he has been subject to the authoritarian and sometimes whimsical decisions of the white power structure. The plantation and the ghetto were created by those who had power to both to confine those who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness. The problem of transforming the ghetto is therefore a problem of power, a confrontation between the forces of power demanding change and the forces of power dedicated to preserving the status quo. Power, properly understood, is the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, or economic changes. In this sense, power is not only desirable but necessary in order to implement the demands of love and justice. One of the greatest problems of history is that the concepts of love and power are usually contrasted as polar opposites. Love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused Nietzsche, the philosopher of will to power, to reject the Christian concept of love. It was the same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. Well, that's true. That sure is true. There is nothing essentially wrong with power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. This has led Negro Americans in the past to seek their goals through love and moral suasion devoid of power, and white Americans to seek their goals through power devoid of love and conscience. It is leading a few extremists today to advocate for Negroes the same destructive and conscienceless power that they have justly abhorred in whites. It is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis of our times. In his struggle for racial justice, the Negro must seek to transform his condition of powerlessness into creative and positive power. One of the most obvious sources of this power is political. In Why Can't We Wait, in Why We Can't Wait, that's another one of his books. I wrote at length of the need for Negroes to unite for political action in order to compel the majority to listen. I urged the development of political awareness and strength in the Negro community, the election of blacks to key positions, and the use of the block vote to liberalize the political climate to achieve our just aspirations for freedom and human dignity. To the extent that Black Power advocates these goals, it is a positive and legitimate call to action that we in the civil rights movement have sought to follow all along and which we must intensify in the future. Black Power is also a call for the pooling of Black financial resources to achieve economic security. While the ultimate answer to the Negro's economic dilemma will be found in a massive federal program for all the poor along the lines of a Philip Randolph's freedom budget, a kind of Marshall Plan for the disadvantaged, there is something that the Negro himself can do to throw off the shackles of poverty. Although the Negro is still at the bottom of the economic ladder, his collective annual income is upwards of $30 billion in 1968. You can figure out the difference if you want. I'm sure it's much more now. This gives him a considerable buying power that can make the difference between profit and loss in many businesses. Through the pooling of such resources and the development of habits of thrift and techniques of wise investment, the Negro will be doing his share to grapple with his problem of economic deprivation. If Black Power means the development of this kind of strength within the Negro community, then it is a quest for basic, necessary, legitimate power. Finally, Black Power is a psychological call to manhood. For years, the Negro has been taught that he is nobody, that his color is a sign of his biological depravity, that his being has been stamped with an indelible imprint of inferiority, that his whole history has been soiled with the filth of worthlessness. All too few people realize how slavery and racial segregation have scarred the soul and wounded the spirit of the Black man. The whole dirty business of slavery was based on the premise that the Negro was a thing to be used, not a person to be respected. The historian Kenneth Stamp, in his remarkable book, The Peculiar Institution, has a fascinating section on the psychological indoctrination that was necessary from the master's viewpoint to make a good slave. He gathered the material for this section primarily from the manuals and other documents which were produced by slave owners on the subject of training slaves. Stamp notes 5 recurring aspects of this training. First, those who managed the slaves had to maintain strict discipline. One master said, "Unconditional submission is the only footing upon which slavery should be placed." Another said, "The slave must know that his master is to govern absolutely, and he is to obey implicitly." that he is never for a moment to exercise either his will or judgment in opposition to a positive order. Second, the masters felt that they had to implant in the bondsman a consciousness of personal inferiority. This sense of inferiority was deliberately extended to his past. The slave owners were convinced that in order to control the Negroes, they had to feel the slaves had to feel that African ancestry tainted them, that their color was a badge of degradation. The third step in the training process was to awe the slaves with a sense of the master's enormous power. It was necessary, various owners said, to make them stand in fear. The fourth aspect was the attempt to persuade the bondsmen to take an interest in the master's enterprise and to accept his standards of good conduct. Thus, the master's criteria of what was good and true and beautiful were to be accepted unquestioningly, by the slaves. The final step, according to Stamp's documents, was to impress Negroes with their helplessness, to create in them a habit of perfect dependence upon their masters. Here, then, was the way to produce a perfect slave. Accustom him to rigid discipline, demand from him unconditional submission, impress upon him a sense of his innate inferiority, develop in him a paralyzing fear of white men, train him to adopt the master's code of good behavior, and instill in him a sense of complete dependence. Out of the soil of slavery came the psychological roots of the Black Power cry. Anyone familiar with the Black Power movement recognizes that defiance of white authority and white power is a constant theme. The defiance almost becomes a kind of taunt. Underneath it, however, there is a legitimate concern that the Negro break away from his unconditional submission and thereby assert his own selfhood. Another obvious reaction of Black Power to the American system of slavery is the determination to glory in Blackness and to resurrect joyously the African past. In response to the emphasis on their master's enormous power, Black Power advocates contend that the Negro must develop his own sense of strength, no longer our fear, awe, and obedience to rule. This accounts for, though it does not justify, some Black Power advocates who encourage contempt and even uncivil disobedience as alternatives to the old patterns of slavery. Black Power assumes that Negroes will be slaves unless there is a new power to counter the force of the men who are still determined to be masters rather than brothers. It is in the context of the slave tradition that some of the ideologues of the Black Power movement call for the need to develop new and indigenous codes of justice for the ghettos, so that Blacks may move entirely away from their former masters' standards of good conduct. Those in the Black Power movement who contend that Blacks should cut themselves off from every level of dependence upon whites for advice, money, or other help are obviously reacting against the slave pattern of perfect dependence upon the masters. Black Power is a psychological reaction to the psychological indoctrination that led to the creation of the perfect slave. While this reaction has often led to negative and unrealistic responses and has frequently brought about intemperate words and actions, one must not overlook the positive value in calling the Negro to a new sense of manhood, to a deep feeling of racial pride, and to an audacious appreciation of his heritage. The Negro must be grasped by a new realization of his dignity and worth. He must stand up amid a system that still oppresses him and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of his own value. He must no longer be ashamed of being Black. The job of arousing manhood within a people that have been taught for so many centuries that they are nobody is not easy. Even semantics have conspired to make that which is black seem ugly and degrading. In Roget's Thesaurus, there are some 120 synonyms for blackness, and at least 60 of them are offensive, such words as blot, soot, grime, devil, and foul. There are some, I remember being at a rally some years ago. God, it must have been 2017 or 2018. And I think it was for like some striking immigrant workers. I can't, or maybe they were in like solidarity with each other. I don't know, but there was a labor speaker, this older white man that got up and spoke, and he was saying there is a blackness that is good, and people did not like that he was using the word black negatively. So it's interesting that even today we have this kind of like, now it's, you can't use the term black to mean anything negative, which is a bit silly. But anyway, people were not very respectful during his speech. And he worked hard on it. Anyway, he came back like a few minutes after everyone, like this was a pretty massive crowd. Everyone like kind of, people were uncomfortable. Some were booing. Some were telling him to stop saying that. Like, people did not react well. He came back a couple moments like after the next speaker and he apologized. I don't know what to think about that. Because I don't think there's anything wrong with using the term black to mean something negative. I think it's not the best. But the fact that people like made it racial or thought that, you can't do that because of race. I don't know. It seemed a bit, we're not over race, however many years later. God, let me think. 60 some years later. No, we're still quite race obsessed. And if you use the term blackness, it will be immediately thought of as racist. So anyway, there are some 134 synonyms for whiteness, and all are favorable. Actually, just to stop this again, I remember this as part of the autobiography of Malcolm X, when he goes into the dictionary and compares white and black. Well, Martin's doing it too. Okay. There are some 134 synonyms for whiteness, and all are favorable, expressed in such words as purity, cleanliness, chastity, and innocence. A white lie is better than a black lie. The most degenerate member of a family is the black sheep, not the white sheep. Really, I didn't think that about the term black sheep. I always thought it just meant you couldn't really fit in with the family. I didn't think it meant you were a degenerate, although that often goes hand in hand. Yeah, that's a good point, S.A. Brady. I like that. I'm sure. I mean, there's how many African cultures are there? There's a ton, but yeah. This is human. This transcends. These concepts transcend, race. This is again all humans struggle with like those concepts. But anyway, yes, my darling. What's wrong? Where are you at? Why are you crying? Y'all. What time is it? 8:30. I'll read a little bit longer and then I'm going to get off of here. I know nobody was really watching earlier, but I was in an accident today. I was at the store and one of the doors fell on me, like in the dairy section. So I was not hurt badly, but I was really shocked by it. It was not a pleasant thing to go through. There was broken glass everywhere, all over me. I mean, not all over me, but and on my scooter, and like it just was very frightening and unsettling. So I'm feeling a bit like, and I don't know. I was in such shock when it happened that I wasn't sure if I was hurt, but I mean, something like that falling on you, it's not, it didn't fall hard. It didn't have far to fall. But what? What? Why are you saying that over there? What? 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 You didn't come up to me and say anything. You just went over there and did it? That doesn't make sense. Why are you displeased with me? Rude. Yeah, so anyway, I'm feeling a bit unsettled and my muscles are all just stressed out. It took me forever to like kind of chill out once I got back home, and I was on my lunch break and I told my boss what happened, and I just had a lot of trouble focusing for like another hour and a half or so, and then I finally did get into a groove, so I ended up working late. Anyway, a lot of information. But yeah. Not pleasant, and it's just funny because most of the workers that came over to assist me already knew me. They're like, "Oh yeah, you're here all the time," and I'm like, "I'm not here all the time, but I'm a regular for." Yeah. Anyway, filled out an incident report, and hopefully, we'll see how I'm feeling tomorrow. I haven't noticed anything too bad about it. I mean, I already have pain issues, so it's kind of like, is this because of this accident or not? But I don't think I was hurt seriously. But man, the shock of it. Okay. Ossie Davis has suggested that maybe the English language should be reconstructed so that teachers will not be forced to teach the Negro child 60 ways to despise himself and thereby perpetuate his false sense of inferiority, and the white child 134 ways to adore himself and thereby perpetuate his false sense of superiority. Oh my. Well, this is, again, only if you identify with your race. You know what I mean? Like, or with your racial label. I mean, what is white and what is black? We understand that like people look different. I understand that because they're from different regions in the world. But like, I don't know. Sometimes I think we're all just too race obsessed as it is. Like, I really do. And being in America, it's even more race obsessed. But it's also a nation of like so many different peoples from so many different places. So it's strange. It's like, it almost seems like we're hyper fixated on it when we should not be. I don't know. Maybe I'm not making sense here. I just, again, like with all of my politics, I don't feel the same kind of passionate rage I did in my youth about like injustice. So, I do wonder sometimes. I see how people are worked up about like race, and you wonder sometimes, like, is this even good for you to be so identified in this way? Because you can't save anybody else in this life. You can only really work on yourself. And I understand the desire to want to like do good things and help other people. And I think that is good too. But like sometimes when it's about identity politics, it can be really destructive to the people involved. You know, you dehumanize yourself in some ways when you're only seeing yourself through one lens. And I see that sometimes with like different people. Like, it's not just race that this happens, obviously, but I do see it with like some Black activists specifically, like modern day people. They get totally consumed, and it's like, you know, before anything, and this is where I get kind of like tripped up. Like, before anything else about you in the world, you know, all of your worldly identities, all of the things about you, you know, the roles you fit in, the space you fit in the world, like, you're a child of God. You're made in the image of God. You're a human being. Like, don't let one facet of you determine who you are, because it isn't. And yeah, I feel like sometimes people get so consumed, and they lose some part of themselves, and it happens in so many different ways. And again, that's the danger of like these identity politics and taking them like so seriously. It's not that you shouldn't take what you're doing in life seriously, but you kind of want to remember, like, what is the ultimate purpose of what you're doing? And, you know, is it just about identity? There has to be more to it than that. And there also has, you know, also have to understand, like, not going down certain roads. Anyway, this is interesting. Like, this section has been interesting. So I'll continue to read a little bit more. But yeah, I'm feeling kind of, the history books, which have almost completely ignored the contribution of the Negro in American history, have only served to intensify the Negro's sense of worthlessness and to augment the anachronistic doctrine of white supremacy. All too many Negroes and whites are unaware of the fact that the first American to shed blood in the revolution which freed this country from British oppression was a black seaman named Crispus Attucks. I didn't know about Crispus Attucks. Have you heard of Crispus Attucks? The first American to shed blood in the revolution which freed this country from British oppression. We'll have to look him up. Negroes and whites are almost totally oblivious of the fact that it was a Negro physician, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who performed the first successful operation on the heart in America, and that another Negro physician, Dr. Charles Drew, was largely responsible for developing the method of separating blood plasma and storing it on a large scale, a process that saved thousands of lives in World War II and has made possible many of the important advances in post-war medicine. History books have virtually overlooked the many Negro scientists and inventors who have enriched American life. Although a few refer to George Washington Carver, whose research in agricultural products helped to revive the economy of the South when the throne of King Cotton began to totter, they ignore the contribution of Norbert Rillieux, whose invention of an evaporating pan revolutionized the process of sugar refining. How many people know that the multi-million-dollar United Shoe Machinery Company developed from the shoe-lasting machine invented in the last century by a Negro from Dutch Guiana, Jan Matzeliger, or that Granville T. Woods, an expert in electric motors, whose many patents speeded the growth and improvement of the railroads at the beginning of this century, was a Negro. Even the Negro's contribution to the music of America is sometimes overlooked in astonishing ways. 2 years ago, my oldest son and daughter entered an integrated school in Atlanta. A few months later, my wife and I were invited to attend a program entitled Music That Has Made America Great. Ooh, Made America Great. Gotta be careful about saying that. As the evening unfolded, we listened to the folk songs and melodies of the various immigrant groups. We were certain that the program would end with the most original of all American music, the Negro spiritual. But we were mistaken. Instead, all the students, including our children, ended the program by singing Dixie. As we rose to leave the hall, my wife and I looked at each other with a combination of indignation and amazement. All the students, black and white, all the parents present that night, and all the faculty members had been victimized by just another expression of America's penchant for ignoring the Negro, making him invisible, and making his contributions insignificant. I wept within that night. I wept for my children and all black children who have been denied a knowledge of their heritage. I wept for all the white children who, through daily miseducation, are taught that the Negro is an irrelevant entity in American society. I wept for all the white parents and teachers who are forced to overlook the fact that the wealth of cultural and technological progress in America is a result of the commonwealth of inpouring contributions. The tendency to ignore the Negro's contribution to American life and to strip him of his personhood is as old as the earliest history books and as contemporary as the morning's newspaper. To offset this cultural homicide, the Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his own Olympian manhood. Any movement for the Negro's freedom that overlooks this necessity is only waiting to be buried. As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom, a firm sense of self-esteem, is the most powerful weapon against the long night of physical slavery. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation or Kennedyan or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can totally bring this kind of freedom. The Negro will only be truly free when he reaches down to the inner depths of his own being and signs with the pen and ink of assertive selfhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. With a spirit straining toward true self-esteem, the Negro must boldly throw off the manacles of self-abnegation and say to himself and the world, I am somebody. I am a person. I am a man with dignity and honor. I have a rich and noble history, however painful and exploited that history has been. I am black and comely. People don't say comely very often, do they? That's a nice word. I do like the word comely. I've thought about using it sometimes, like, oh, what a comely affect. Yes, she is quite a comely lady. This self-affirmation is the black man's need, made compelling by the white man's crimes against him. This is positive and necessary power for black people. And hello, Madam Sane. I am staying warm. I did go out briefly today and got hit by a couple gusts of wind, but it was nothing I couldn't survive. Oh, excuse me, but I will not be going out again for the next few days, it seems. We will be having snow again tomorrow, apparently, and it will be I think the next day will actually start to heat up, so the snow should be melted probably by the weekend, but this week will be pretty cold, I think. All right, so I'm going to continue reading a little bit longer. And again, for those just joining, I'm reading from Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community by Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, I like that. I love the Negro spirituals and the my friend Lavinia, she would sing sometimes. She had this one that was she had a couple that she sang, but one, her favorite one, it was kind of a gospel song too. It was about someone who is missing their child. I'm not going to sing it, but anyway, I'm thinking about it now. Anyway. Nevertheless, in spite of the positive aspects of Black power, which are compatible with what we have sought to do in the civil rights movement all along without the slogan, its negative values, I believe, prevent it from having the substance and program to become the basic strategy for the civil rights movement in the days ahead. Beneath all the satisfaction of a gratifying slogan, Black power is a nihilistic philosophy born out of the conviction that the Negro can't win. It is, at bottom, the view that American society is so hopelessly corrupt and enmeshed in evil that there is no possibility of salvation from within. Although this thinking is understandable, as a response to a white power structure that never completely committed itself to true equality for the Negro, and a die-hard mentality that sought to shut all windows and doors against the winds of change, it nonetheless carries the seeds of its own doom. Before this century, virtually all revolutions had been based on hope and hate. The hope was expressed in the rising expectation of freedom and justice. The hate was an expression of bitterness towards the perpetrators of the old order. It was the hate that made revolutions bloody and violent. What was new about Mahatma Gandhi's movement in India was that he mounted a revolution on hope and love, hope and nonviolence. This same new emphasis characterized the civil rights movement in our country, dating from the Montgomery bus boycott of 1956 to the Selma movement of 1965. We maintained the hope while transforming the hate of traditional revolutions into positive nonviolent power. As long as the hope was fulfilled, there was little questioning of nonviolence. But when the hopes were blasted, when people came to see that in spite of progress, their conditions were still insufferable, when they looked out and saw more poverty, more school segregation, and more slums, despair began to set in. Unfortunately, when hope diminishes, the hate is often turned most bitterly towards those who originally built up the hope. In all the speaking I have done in the United States before varied audiences, including some hostile whites, the only time I have been booed was one night in a Chicago mass meeting by some young members of the Black Power movement. Wow. I mean, I can't imagine. Like, even if you didn't, but I mean, I guess they're contemporaries or they saw themselves that way. But, like, can you imagine? They were alive at the same time as Martin Luther King Jr., and they booed him, even though they were like, I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, I can see, like, I could see having like political disagreements or something, but like I can't imagine again the audacity. Like, I guess he's become more, but maybe because he's become more legendary since his death, you know, you think about it. But even then, you know, I wonder, I'm like, he'd already done so much, you know, he'd already organized so much and been through so much, and also just, you know, a reverend. Like it doesn't seem right. The behavior doesn't seem right. I went home that night with an ugly feeling. Selfishly, I thought of my sufferings and sacrifices over the last 12 years. Why would they boo one so close to them? But as I lay awake thinking, I finally came to myself, and I could not for the life of me have less than patience and understanding for those young people. For 12 years, I and others like me had held out radiant promises of progress. I had preached to them about my dream. I had lectured to them about the not too distant day when they would have freedom, all here and now. I had urged them to have faith in America and in white society. Their hopes had soared. They were now booing because they felt that we were unable to deliver on our promises. They were booing because we had urged them to have faith in people who had often proven to be unfaithful. They were now hostile because they were watching the dream that they had so readily accepted turn into a frustrating nightmare. But revolution born through despair cannot long be sustained by despair. This is the ultimate contradiction of the Black Power movement. It claims to be the most revolutionary wing of the social revolution taking place in the United States, yet it rejects the one thing that keeps the fire of revolutions burning, the ever-present flame of hope. When hope dies, a revolution degenerates into an undiscriminating catch-all for evanescent and futile gestures. Yo! He's got some sentences in this writing, doesn't he? Like, I'll read that again. When hope dies, a revolution degenerates into an undiscriminating catch-all for evanescent and futile gestures. I have seen this to be true. I have seen this to be true. The Negro cannot entrust his destiny to a philosophy nourished solely on despair, to a slogan that cannot be implemented into a program. The Negro's disappointment is real and a part of the daily menu of our lives. One of the most agonizing problems of human experience is how to deal with disappointment. In our individual lives, we all too often distill our frustrations into an essence of bitterness, or drown ourselves in the deep waters of self-pity, or adopt fatalistic philosophy that whatever happens must happen and all events are determined by necessity. These reactions poison the soul and scar the personality, always harming the person who harbors them more than anyone else. The only healthy answer lies in one's honest recognition of disappointment, even as he still clings to hope. One's acceptance of finite disappointment, even while clinging to infinite hope. We Negroes who have dreamed for so long of freedom are still confined in a prison of segregation and discrimination. Must we respond with bitterness and cynicism? Certainly not, for this can lead to black anger so desperate that it ends in black suicide. Must we turn inward in self-pity? Of course not, for this can lead to a self-defeating black paranoia. Must we conclude that we cannot win? Certainly not, for this will lead to black nihilism that seeks disruption for disruption's sake. Must we be fatalistically concluding that segregation is a foreordained pattern of the universe? Resign ourselves to oppression? Of course not, for passively to cooperate with an unjust system makes the oppressed as evil as the oppressors. Our most fruitful course is to stand firm, move forward nonviolently, accept disappointments, and cling to hope. Our determined refusal not to be stopped will eventually open the door to fulfillment. By recognizing the necessity of suffering in a righteous cause, we may achieve our humanity's full stature. To guard ourselves from bitterness, we need the vision to see in this generation's ordeals the opportunity to transfigure both ourselves and the American society. In 1956, I flew from New York to London in the propeller-type aircraft that required 9.5 hours for a flight, now made in 6 hours by jet. I'm trying to envision this, what sort of aircraft he flew in. Returning from London to the United States, the stewardess announced that the flying time would be 12.5 hours. The distance was the same. Why an additional 3 hours? When the pilot entered the cabin to greet the passengers, I asked him to explain. You must understand about the winds, he said. When we leave New York, a strong tailwind is in our favor. But when we return, a strong headwind is against us. Then he added, don't worry, these 4 engines are capable of battling the winds. In any social revolution, there are times when the tailwinds of triumph and fulfillment favor us, and other times when strong headwinds of disappointment and setbacks beat us relentlessly. We must not permit adverse winds to overwhelm us as we journey across life's mighty Atlantic. We must be sustained by our engines of courage in spite of the winds. This refusal to be stopped, this courage to be, this determination to go on in spite of, is the hallmark of any great movement. The Black Power movement of today, like the Garvey Back to Africa movement of the 20s, represents a dashing of hope, a conviction of the inability of the Negro to win, and a belief in the infinitude of the ghetto. While there is so much grounding in the past experience for all these feelings, a revolution cannot succumb to any of them. Today's despair is a poor chisel to carve out tomorrow's justice. Black power is an implicit and often explicit belief in Black separatism. Notice that I do not call it Black racism. It is inaccurate to refer to Black power as racism in reverse, as some have recently done. Racism is a doctrine of the congenital inferiority and worthlessness of a people. While a few angry proponents of Black power have, in moments of bitterness, made wild statements that come close to this kind of racism, the major proponents of Black power have never contended that the white man is innately worthless. Yet behind Black power's legitimate and necessary concern for group unity and Black identity lies the belief that there can be a separate Black road to power and fulfillment. Few ideas are more unrealistic. There is no salvation for the Negro through isolation. One of the chief affirmations of Black power is the call for the mobilization of political strength for Black people. But we do not have to look far to see that effective political power for Negroes cannot come through separatism. Granted that there are cities and counties in the country where the Negro is in a majority, there are so few that concentration on them alone would still leave the vast majority of Negroes outside the mainstream of American political life. Out of the 80-odd counties in Alabama, the state where SNCC sought to develop an all-Black party, only 9 have a majority of Negroes. Even if Blacks could control each of these counties, they would have little influence in overall state politics and could do little to improve conditions in the major Negro population centers of Birmingham, Mobile, and Montgomery. There are still relatively few congressional districts in the South that have had such large Black majorities that Negro candidates could be elected without the aid of whites. It is a sounder program to concentrate on the election of 2 or 3 Negro congressmen from predominantly Negro districts, or to concentrate on the election of 15 or 20 Negro congressmen from southern districts where a coalition of Negro and white moderate voters is possible. All right, I'm going to stop there, y'all. I cannot continue. But it was interesting picking up the book and getting sucked into it. And thank you for listening, those of you who did. Yeah, what a day. I don't know. I'm beat. I need to retire. I need to go and do my settling down for the evening, I think. I need to get out of all this and get into something cozy and get into my bed and rest. So anyway, thanks for watching along and listening. And yeah, S.A. Brady wins the chat today and is tired too. Yeah. All right. Well, good night, y'all. And I will be back another time.